our presentation is a question that we hope you will help us answer. How you are helping preserve wilderness character. Um, we're going to do a refresher of the qualities of wilderness that help make wilderness character, and we'll do an overview of those pretty quickly here. And then we're going to pivot and ask you to help brainstorm how the work you do helps preserve those qualities of wilderness. Or even if maybe you don't, but you have a colleague who you know has a really interesting connection, we'd love to hear back about that. By the end of the presentation, we hope to have a sort of robust list, and I literally am going to go into typing mode and type up what you share, because we want to have a creative list, healthy list of all the ways you help preserve wilderness character. Okay. Marissa, did you want to say anything in particular about what you hope that we accomplish today?
Yeah, I think this is just a great thinking exercise. I know a lot of us have kind of our niche or our specialty of where we work in public lands, and so it's a great opportunity to see other areas or aspects of wilderness that are being worked on by other people and hearing what they have to say. So it's a great opportunity to hear from colleagues and other people on the presentation in this meeting.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Marissa. I agree. We're going to learn some stuff. Okay, so with the first slide, Marissa's going to go through some key components of the Wilderness Act.
Yeah, thanks, Colter. We want to start out with making sure we all are on the same page about what these wilderness qualities are. To do that, we want to start with the definition of wilderness from the 1964 Wilderness Act, and this is Section 2C. And the most important aspects of this are the bolded text, because I'm not going to read this whole paragraph to you. So we want to know for wilderness, these are going to be areas where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. These areas are undeveloped federal lands, retaining its primeval character and influence without permanent improvements or human habitation. These areas are protected and managed so as to preserve its natural conditions. They generally appear to have been affected primarily by the forces of nature. They have outstanding opportunities for solitude or primitive and unconfined type of recreation. And they may also, but don't all, have ecological, geological, or other features of scientific, educational, scenic, or historical value. And that's a lot of information, which is why we've broken this down into wilderness qualities, right? So we're going to start getting into each of those individual qualities, and Coulter's going to start us off with the untrammeled quality.
Yeah. So before I leave the slide here, we bolded the stuff. It's going to show up again. We're going to break the big text down, the bold stuff, into some specifics. And indeed, starting with untrammeled, this first quality of wilderness, this, or at least the initial one, untrammeled, it's an area, and this is from the law, Marissa just reviewed this, an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, generally appears to have been affected primarily by the forces of nature. Another way put, wilderness is essentially unhindered and free from modern human control and manipulation. I find often people struggle to understand this at first, and I did, certainly. I didn't understand this like notion that untrammeled means that we're doing very little or nothing to affect the course of nature. Some ways that we can measure trammeling, the number of times we've trammeled, which is contrary to the desired untrammeled state. Here's some examples. When we spray weeds or remove weeds, that certainly can be a good thing for the natural quality, but we're actually interfering with nature's course. Um, and so in this case, there's a potentially a good thing for natural quality, which we'll talk about natural in a minute here, but it's actually not great for untrammeled in a sense. When we put out wildfires that started in a natural way, a natural caused fire, we're stopping the course of nature. Many of our landscapes are fire adapted and in a sense need fire to rejuvenate and be healthy. And when we suppress naturally caused fires, we're trammeling. We're contrary to the untrammeled desired, the desired untrammeled. Collaring wildlife, and even in like a singular instance, might not seem like it would have a lot of effect, but that's sort of a classic trammeling example. And I think I remember some early wilderness awareness trainings that the word trammel comes from a French word tramal, and it has to do with the collaring of for a horse. Well, collaring wildlife is an example there. The active handling, trapping, uh, applying a device to it, releasing it, that does have a trammeling effect, even in a singular instance. Stalking a fish, even if a native fish, that is trammeling. We're interfering with the course of nature. Maybe that native fish was expatriated for natural reasons. Maybe there was a change in the river morphology, and that native fish was lost. But if we choose to reintroduce it, which could be for good reasons, that actually does have an effect on untrammeled. Two other examples here, not limited to only these examples, these are just good examples. Unauthorized actions like trespass of cattle. Well, cattle would have um, an effect on the landscape, and if it wasn't authorized, it wasn't planned. That's a trammeling effect. And the illegal introduction of non-native species. Often we think of weeds. I'll give an example. In my area, in Alberta, there are wild pigs. And there's a little bit of a concern that they will cross the border and come into the Pop Marshall Wilderness Complex and cause some disruption to our local landscape. So those are just several examples of ways we can measure essentially the untrammeled state of our wilderness by how frequently we are trammeling it. Um, and that's a quick overview of untrammeled. I'm going to turn it to Marissa, I believe, for natural next.
Yep. So our next quality is the natural quality. So this says that wilderness is protected and managed so as to preserve its natural conditions, again, from that definition from Section 2C. Essentially, wilderness ecological systems are substantially free from the effects of modern civilization. The way I usually think about this is we want a wilderness that doesn't have human-caused threats to the abiotic and biotic components of a wilderness area, and that is encompass of both of those. So we usually think of the plants and animals, but again, there's all these other factors and systems and processes happening in a wilderness that can be affected by human-caused action. So some of the measures that we want to look at here, or even the lack of these things, are species of concern. That's across the board. We've got that all over the place where species have been impacted by actions from humans, whether expanding development, civilization, the spread of invasives, or the presence of livestock and diseases that livestock bring. Species of concern in a wilderness is something we would want to measure. Getting to one of those points I just mentioned is non-native. So the presence or pathways for non-native and invasive species into a wilderness area is something that we would measure because they're going to impact those native species, right? Grazing is also important, as Colter said, for the natural quality. In a lot of places we have grazing, and sometimes it's been implemented to mimic natural herbivory, but these are livestock, they're non-native species, and they're not going to act the same way that the native herbivores would have, and they cause a lot of other problems. So this would be something that detracts from the natural quality. Then we get into those abiotic components. So we're also interested in things like visibility, ozone, acid deposition, forms of pollution that could be in either our airway, our waterways, or anywhere else that's affecting the biotic components within a wilderness and even the surrounding area. So we also include things like water quality, issues with erosion and loss of soil in areas. Again, could because of grazing near a waterway, and we're having a lot of erosion because of that. We're also looking at unnatural vegetation or fuel loading. I'm sure most of you are aware, I'm in Region 8. We just got hit last year by a pretty awful hurricane, and we've got a lot of downed trees. And there are a lot of instances where that can happen, and now we've got this kind of overabundance of fuel on the ground, and it's changed the canopy structure, right? So instances where humans have impacted the climate or other factors of the wilderness and caused unnatural vegetation or fuel loading are also important for natural quality. We're also looking at how can species move, right? We want our native species to be able to move freely and have the full range that they need for their life cycle. So loss of habitat connectivity is something we would also measure for the natural quality. So that's a brief overview. It's not inclusive of all of the things for the natural quality, but it's a good list to start. And Colter will take us on to the next quality.
Yeah. Okay. So we're halfway through, I think, ish, of the quality reviews. Undeveloped quality. An area of undeveloped federal land, in this case, let's acknowledge there are other types of wild areas and not all in federal ownership, um, without permanent improvement or human habituation, again, coming from the law, and where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. Another way put is wilderness retains its primeval. I love that word, primeval. Kind of makes me, it's sort of a zinger word. Retains its primeval character and influence and is essentially without permanent improvement or modern human occupation. Some of the ways we can measure or check on the state of undeveloped include the number of authorized non-recreation oriented physical developments. So we're not talking about like campsites, camping equipment in this instance. We're talking about scientific equipment, um, like thermocouples, monitoring stations in water, radio repeaters, fish barriers. On my unit, we're having a conversation about some solar panels to operate some radio, some new radio repeater systems. Another example is unauthorized non-recreational physical development. So this could be like a source of forms of poaching, essentially, an illegal stock pond that is not authorized to be in that wilderness. It's not meant to be there. It wasn't authorized. Um, in holdings, private property or state property or other ownership types of property within the federal land system of wilderness and in holding, that's a degree of development typically because there's often development on that. Um, Also administrative mechanization or motorized, where the number of times we've chosen to and approved use of motorized vehicles, mechanized use, things that are typically authorized through a minimum requirements analysis. If this is being approved, it's typically contrary to undeveloped. So the number of times we approve that or use that equipment is a way to measure the undeveloped quality. Also, emergency mechanization. The distinction between the point I just said above and this and the one below is administrative mechanization. That's like for a project, right? So we want to use a helicopter to transport supplies for a bridge. We want to, do something, use a piece of mechanized transport for a project. Whereas emergency mechanization is we're responding to an emergency, whether search and rescue, fire response, or something like that, and we're using a helicopter or a chainsaw. So again, the way we can measure undeveloped is the lack of the number of instances of these things. Okay, gonna turn it back to Marissa.
All right. It's the next one. It's got the longest name. Well, it's the hardest one to remember, I think. So now we're looking at solitude or primitive and unconfined recreation. So wilderness has outstanding opportunities for solitude or a primitive and unconfined type of recreation. Essentially, wilderness provides outstanding opportunities for these. I will point out that it does very specifically use the word or. It doesn't have to be both. We're just looking to preserve at least one of them. And the way that the measures are broken down by indicator also separated out into things that get at solitude and things that get at primitive or unconfined recreation. So we'll start out with things that really address the solitude aspect of wilderness. So some measures we might be looking at are the number of visitor contacts. So how many people are out in the wilderness area when you're out there? The more people, the less solitude you have, right? That's what a lot of us go out to wilderness for. The area within a wilderness that is affected by travel routes. That could be within or outside of the wilderness area. I know a lot of wilderness areas have major highways or railways right on the border of a wilderness. So you can imagine being within a wilderness and having an expectation, but all day long you're hearing vehicles go by on a highway, right? So that detracts from solitude. We're also looking at things like night sky visibility or soundscape. At night, are you getting a lot of bright lights from nearby major cities? And is that detracting from what you'd expect in a wilderness area, not being able to see the stars? In soundscapes, again, listening to those cars all day long, listening to trains all day long. It's not really what you expect from a wilderness. So they really detract from this quality. Then we'll get into kind of that primitive, unconfined recreation that we want to preserve. So we'll look at things like recreational facilities, starting with authorized things like trails, toilets, bridges, shelters. These are all of the things that the agencies have put in place in a wilderness area for visitors to use. But we also have unauthorized recreation facilities, and we also want to track those. And that include things like user-created campsites, unauthorized climbing hardware and equipment, illegal motorized trails, and even social trails. So those can exist in a wilderness area. They're not authorized by the agency managing the land, but we also want to count them because other folks are using them when they're out in a wilderness area. And the last thing is really, really honing in on that unconfined part is we have all these other qualities that we have to preserve, such as the natural quality. And so we as managers may have to put in place restrictions on the visitors to protect other aspects of a wilderness area. And they may improve the natural quality, but they do detract from this unconfined recreation. And so it is a negative for solitude or primitive unconfined recreation. So I'll
Yeah.
let Colter end us with our last one.
Yeah. Before we leave this one, I wanted to share the soundscape one speaks to me um, as something that affects my sense of primitive recreation and solitude in my area. On a certain day, you can actually hear the train that is outside of the wilderness, but you can hear it actually about 7 miles in if you're in the sort of right aspect on the side of the hill, and you can even see, just barely see the parking lot, the trailhead. So yeah, that gives me a sense that somebody's nearby. Okay, the last quality of wilderness, and we'll wrap up our review of the qualities of wilderness, and then we're going to go into brainstorm mode with you. The last one is unique or other features of your wilderness. So I think of this as an asterisk, like the specific footnotes to your wilderness. They're definitely different from place to place. From the law that we read earlier, may also contain ecological, geological, or other features of scientific, educational, scenic, or historical use, historical value. And in other words, wilderness preserves unique attributes or other features that affect the character of a specific wilderness. So I'll use some from my area. Um, we have historical value in our area. We have an intact patrol cabin system and a historic phone line and the trails that serve those cabins and also the supporting lookouts, structures that all composes what was place in the early, started being built in the after the 1910 fires, 1920s, 1930s. In the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, that whole network is still intact. It's a historic district, a nationally designated historic district. You will usually think of historic districts as like a quaint downtown or a little historic New England town with like Queen Anne style housing. We don't have that in the Bob Marshall, but we do have a historic district that has these log cabins in most cases, a crank phone line, and these trails and lookouts that all support early day ranger life and its living history. We're still using those things like the early day rangers. We're continuing to honor that history and live that way. So that's a local example of historic value. I'm always inspired. I want to use geologic as another example, not in my wilderness so much, but I'm always inspired when I hear about these amazing fossils that have been found in wilderness areas that are not only of significant geological value because it helps us better understand our geologic history, um, but they also just inform science overall. And we'll pivot to science. I'll use a local example for me. The Bob Marsh Wilderness Complex is a place of much scientific discovery. We've learned in the way, one of the sort of quips, the way we put it is from grizzly bears to water bears, those tiny little microscopic organisms that live in lichen. We have studies going on from those big old grizzly bears that everybody sees to the tiny, almost invisible water bears that can go to space and survive on no water and come back and still be alive, there's a lot of scientific value in this wilderness landscape. So those are just some examples of local examples of the unique or other qualities of wilderness. Now, how would you measure those things is the question. Well, that's for you to figure out as a wilderness steward. In our case, that historic district that I mentioned, we periodically inventory the condition of the cabins, the phone line, the trails. We have Forest Service systems for doing that, and so we just sample that data periodically. And in some cases, our cabins are doing well. We've been doing restoration work and maintenance work. In other cases, the phone line's not doing well. And we haven't been able to maintain it in some time, and it's not fully intact like was. The phone line has fallen down in some places. So in that case, we would say, too bad that that element of the historic quality is going down in condition. I'm interested to think how we could measure the quality of geology or science. I don't know, but maybe we can brainstorm a little bit about that. So we're coming to our wrap up of review here again around the unique or other qualities. That's for your unit to define and for you to figure out how you might measure it and manage or monitor that. If you don't know what your other unique or other qualities are, I encourage you to locate a wilderness character narrative that may help you and or have a conversation with a wilderness manager near you. Okay, so get ready, everybody. We're going to start brainstorming here. We want to know how you help preserve wilderness character. Think about the work that you do on a daily basis or periodic basis and how that relates to these qualities of wilderness. We've got a little refresher for you here on the slides as you start brainstorming. How might your work help protect and preserve untrammeled, natural, undeveloped, solitude or primitive and unconfined recreation, or one of those other unique things to your wilderness? How is your work helping preserve those things? We'll let you sort of brainstorm here for a moment. Marissa, do you want to pose any questions or prompts here before we start hopefully hearing from our audience?
You know, I think that it's a very interesting. I would be curious, kind of what our matrix here is of folks, what agency they're working with, because the types of measures that are selected can be very agency dependent. The different agencies have some uniqueness about how they go about monitoring wilderness character. And so I'm always curious about the perspectives folks are coming with. Which agency are you working with, and how has that influenced your understanding of wilderness character and how you measure and monitor wilderness character?
Christy's getting us started here. What we'd like to do is have you either raise your hand, and that is preferred because we'd like to make sure we hear your full version. But either raise your hand and share with us out loud, or go ahead and put in the chat how you help preserve wilderness character. All right, so Christy's leading out. She helps teach about the use of traditional tools, and that helps preserve the undeveloped quality and primitive recreation. Christy, could you just share with us a little bit more on what type of tools, and just bring that to life for us?
Yeah, I help certify people in crosscut and axe skills and teach a lot of volunteers and get volunteers certified and then lead volunteer events using those tools to maintain trails.
Great examples. Okay, there you go. We got that one. Thank you, Christy. Okay. All right. What else is somebody thinking that that you either do right now, or maybe you're a little new to this work and you're anticipating you're going to do this work this year?
Yeah, I guess I've done a couple things for wilderness character. One being I've done some wilderness character monitoring, so I do think, having information about what the qualities of wilderness in your wilderness area are, like what if you have a unique or other feature of value, kind of available to managers, and having some idea about how to measure those things, and referring back to them, hopefully, is something that helps preserve wilderness character in an area. And I was also going to mention for everyone here, I think attending NWSI, especially if you don't really know that much about wilderness or the foundational principles of wilderness, ahead of time, I think can be really impactful in getting you started and learning about wilderness character and about how to preserve wilderness character. Because I promise you will be, it takes a while to get your mind around like what a trambling action is. And this might be like a refresher for you or like a first step, but it's always good to be brushed up on that so you're ready to chat with other people about it.
Thank you. Hey, I'm curious if anybody out there inventories campsites in wilderness. You do the hiking or however you travel there. And then you have your protocol to inventory how big the campsite is, how much development is in the campsite. Is there one fire ring? Is there two fire rings? Is there a food hang? Are there benches? Does anybody here do campsite monitoring?
I've
That's a
done
pretty cl Oh, go ahead.
I've done a decent amount of campsite monitoring.
Yeah, that's a classic wilderness task, right? Um, and so, um, campsite monitoring would classically fit under solitude and primitive and unconfined recreation. Marissa, can you help us understand that?
Yeah, so I think, we're looking at solitude, right? The solitude is your opportunity to be away from others, which is different from our lives in the cities and towns that most of us live in, right? So it's not just the presence of other people, it's the clues and other things left behind by other people, right? That tells us that a lot of people have been here or they're really using this area. It's not just me. So fortunately, campsites, but then other things like I wouldn't even say like presence of trash, presence, particularly when people are dumping things in the wilderness. Unfortunately, that happens, right? It's another example of you knowing that other people have been here and they've left behind these remnants of modern human civilization.
Yeah, thank you. Um, Yeah, Christy, I was also going to ask about, and Dan just put this in here too. I was going to ask about trails. Who here has done work with trails for maintaining trails, inventorying the condition of trails? How does taking care of our trail system relate to the qualities of wilderness? Christy and Dan in the chat just both put that down there as they do help with that. Um, that, in my mind, relates to primitive and unconfined recreation. While we don't want too many high-end trails in wilderness, because wilderness is meant to be a challenging landscape, um, being thoughtful about where we do have trails and having them well maintained helps concentrate use in an appropriate way and keeps it from spreading and impacting things we don't want impacted, um, and helps provide a healthy form of primitive recreation. And it may also help protect undeveloped too, right? That we don't have trails that we don't want on the landscape or user defined trails. Um, anyways, uh, Marissa, did you have any more thoughts about trail maintenance and how that relates to some of the qualities of wilderness?
Well, I wanted to point out one of the comments from Tiffany says a good trail will keep people on the trail and preserve untrammeled, also reduces spread of invasives, right? So we're reducing that impacts because impacts do happen. I think that's a great point that she brought up. So include that in our list.
I'm gonna, you guys, it's tough always doing this typing live because then I gotta manage my spell check. So have a little patience with me. I'll keep typing. Oh, Julia, could you share a little more on your vision for how trails relates to natural quality, maintaining trails?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it can be a bit of a trade-off because preventing people from walking anywhere they want can be seen as like combining recreation in some way, but as Coulter mentioned, but also I see it as like allowing people a pathway so that they're not trampling on sensitive vegetation, especially if you're working in like an alpine environment where there's a lot of like low, shrubbery or sensitive plant species, preventing people from walking everywhere and covering the whole, everywhere, I think can prevent degradation of the natural quality.
Yeah. And then we're pointing here that trail maintenance actually connects to a whole lot of stuff here. Mike, you just put in the chat, maintaining certain trails can help disperse recreational use and not concentrate it too much in certain overused areas. Right on. That's a conversation we're having in my area about being thoughtful when we have limited ability to clear all of our trails. Let's be thoughtful about the ones we are able to maintain and that help disperse people so as to protect this, help preserve the quality of solitude, that people have a chance to travel to other places and not all be stuck to the same trail system. Um, so trail maintenance, you might thought you were just using a crosscut on a trail and battling with your axe. Turns out you're doing a whole lot there to help preserve many qualities of wilderness. I'm curious who feels like they're doing work related to the natural quality, something we haven't heard about yet. Who's doing work that helps protect the ecological systems of our wilderness and ensure that they're substantially free of the effects of modern civilization? Is anybody doing weeds inventories? Um, whether removing weeds or just even inventorying them. That's a pretty classic task in wilderness. Maybe we don't have anybody in our audience, but I'm going to put it on here. Invasives. Oh, thank you, Christy.
And water testing. Thanks, Christy.
Christy, what kind of water testing have you done? We don't do that in my area, so I'm curious to learn more on how that actually looks in your place, where you are.
In Ellicott, no, not Ellicott, in Raven Raven Cliffs Wilderness in Georgia. Am I messing that up? We went out and did um so there's a trail that goes along along a stream up to a waterfall, and it was getting impacts from erosion from all the camping and hiking. And yeah, I went out with a person from the University of Georgia. And I'm not a water expert, so I'm gonna probably butcher the description of it, but we, stirred up the water and collected all the bugs and analyzed the water quality based on all the bugs living in the water, or the nymph stages of the bugs. And and got that tested to understand all the impacts to the water. Because once a water system comes up as impaired, you need to start doing more tests to figure out how exactly it is impaired.
Hmm.
And yeah, and what species can live in the water indicates how clean the water is.
Thanks, Christy. That's a good one. I was thinking you were saying like maybe a chemical test of the water, and maybe that is done somewhere, but in this case, you were using the biotic community that you sampled that's in the water to infer the quality. That's interesting to me.
Hmm.
We had a great presentation on this at WSI this year, about water quality and presence of species and how that can tell you a lot about the water.
Hey, Marissa, I have one for you.
Mhm.
When we were talking earlier about grazing of
Mhm.
livestock in wilderness, some people do monitor grazing operations and in wilderness. Um, how extensively the area has been grazed, how well the permit holder is conforming with their permit, their operating plan, things like that. Can you help me understand how that would relate to one of the qualities or several of the qualities of wilderness?
Sure. So From my experience, this heavily relates to untrammeled and natural, which are interesting qualities because there's a little bit of a checks and balances between those two, right? Sometimes we do something to improve the natural quality, but that action itself is a trammeling. And so grazing, I feel like, is a great example of this, where we may allow grazing in a wilderness area or other public lands. And there is a lot of folks who would choose this method to replace what was grazing from native species previously, but now that we've lost populations of those species or their ranges have been reduced, we are using domesticated livestock in place of that to try to mimic that behavior and pretty much step into that part of the ecosystem processes that's required for seed spreading and controlling of vegetation. Obviously, though, that is us choosing to manipulate the wilderness. So it is trammeling. We are interfering by bringing livestock into a wilderness area. It can have some benefits for the natural quality. It can also have some negative impacts to the natural quality. So it's always great to be monitoring it, to make sure that the grazing, the owners are following the regulations that we're setting for them. They're following the rules that they agreed to, and that we aren't having problems with, like I said, erosion along waterways, spreading invasives where we don't want them spreading vegetation, bringing in diseases. I did mention that, and that's something that I've seen National Wildlife Refuges monitor the presence of invasive diseases because you can have livestock transfer disease to native species that aren't adapted to a disease in that area. So it affects a lot of things.
Oh, and did you say invasive disease? Was that the
Yes,
phrase you used?
specifically invasive disease. Yes, a couple examples of this outside of grazing. White nose syndrome. I think most people know about that one at this point,
That's a
right?
great one. Thank you for sharing it. That makes sense to
Yes.
me. Yeah.
So that spread of white nose syndrome or a presence in a wilderness area is hugely impactful for bat species. We all know super important for ecosystems. But there are other examples. I know National Wildlife Refuges that are monitoring the presence of West Nile virus because it can decimate avian bird populations. So yeah, invasive diseases, it's a growing, emerging problem in a lot of places. Um, chytrid fungus, there's many others.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. That makes perfect sense now that you've explained it. I appreciate that. That there's people monitoring for those things, and that relates to the natural quality for that wilderness. Um, I wanted to brainstorm with everybody a little bit more on how some of us might be helping preserve the untrammeled quality of wilderness. Let's focus on that one for a moment here. So untrammeled wilderness is essentially unhindered and free from modern human control or manipulation. How, what's the work that we here in this group are doing that relates to that? Um, I'll give one example while the audience is thinking. For the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, we do have a larger landscape that is fire adapted, um, and we are helping preserve the untrammeled quality related to the fire ecosystem in two ways. Um, when conditions align, and there's a whole lot of conditions to talk about, but I'll just say when conditions align, we do try to allow fire to play its natural role on the landscape so that we aren't trammeling the landscape by putting the fire out. So just in the decision to go, no go, suppress a fire when it's first found, or allow fire to play its natural role, I and those I work with, that's an act of preserving the untrammeled quality. Um, but we also do something even after that first initial choice that's made. The other way that we're helping preserve the untrammeled quality is when we do choose to allow a fire to grow, we might not allow it to grow unconfined. We'll use that word in all ways. We might be saying this side of the fire we want to suppress, but this side of the fire we're comfortable with growing. And so it's not just the initial response to the fire, it might be over the duration of the fire event. We're making choices, continual choices on how we manage that fire. And we found a way to essentially measure that. Have we fully, and we grade ourselves essentially, have we fully allowed the fires this year to grow? Whatever they were going to do, we didn't stop it. Maybe they stayed small, but we didn't do anything, or maybe they got bigger, we didn't do anything. Or we fully put the fire out from as and even though it did grow, we still kept fully trying to put the fire out. But we also have a middle ground of, well, we partially suppressed the fire in this area, but we also allowed the fire to do what it was going to do on its own in this other area. And we have a way of sort of categorizing that and weighting that. And then we're measuring that over time. How frequently we're not just choosing one thing or the other, we're choosing sometimes middle ground, and we're evaluating how well we're essentially doing that over time. That's one way that we're trying to measure and the work and the choices we make to preserve the untrammeled quality. I'm wondering if we can think of any other examples, practical examples of how we're protecting the untrammeled quality. Marissa, I'm wondering what you're thinking about for the untrammeled quality right now.
So I love the example from our slides of fish stocking. But another one related to untrammeled and animal species, which I find really interesting, is choosing or not choosing to do predator control, in both in and outside of a wilderness. We typically think of things happening within the wilderness are related to wilderness character, but things that happen outside of the wilderness also impact the wilderness. So large predators that have the ability to be very mobile and have large ranges, they could be controlled outside of a wilderness, and that still would be counted as a trammeling within wilderness because it impacts the population dynamics within the wilderness area. So there are a lot of competing priorities with that, right? We have folks concerned with large predators who have livestock. We have folks concerned with large predators who want to hunt and fish. And so there's a lot of competing. And so being able to make that choice to say, hey, actually, we're not going to interfere with these predator populations. We're going to protect wilderness character and the untrammeled quality is always a win. And coming up with other ways to address the issues that they can cause outside of wilderness. But it goes both ways. I've seen it where, predator control happens by a state agency because it's off of federal public land, but it's adjacent to a wilderness area. So you also have that competing where another agency or organization might make a decision right outside of wilderness, but it trammels the wilderness that you manage. So I think we have a hand up. Samir, if you'd like to share your comment, question?
Yes, hello. Hello. I'm truly enjoying the conversation and the brainstorm session. It's amazing. And I find a lot of differences between managing the wilderness in the States and here in Lebanon, since we're new with the idea of rangers. Predators here in Lebanon were nearly extinct, and they were extinct because not because some authority or management wild animal or predator management control. They were extinct just for poaching and for hunting. And back then there was no one to control it. And then there came the law that protects the animals. And after like 4 years, we started operating. And it's a hustle here in Lebanon to spread the word. However, we are seeing a lot of changes. But also with the war that's happening, lots of migratory birds and vultures and raptors are just redirecting their migration routes. We get a lot of rescue and we release them, we rehab. However, on the other hand, you'll have more that are being killed and poached. So it's a hustle here, but what we're working on is with the authority to spread this word, and hopefully it will work. But what I'd also like to add, because I'm following a lot of, I don't know if it's true. So you were talking about Marissa, you were talking about the predators. Is it true that the laws, some states are allowing the poaching of wolves, and there's a fight around that? Is that true?
Yes, it's a hot topic, very hot topic in the US and
Uh,
has been for a long time and will continue to be for a while.
uh,
Yeah, it's in a state decision in many places,
mm,
particularly in the northern western part of our country. And there are a lot of organizations, individuals, members of the public, other agencies that are trying to fight that. Yes.
mm, mm. Okay, so that's it. I'm not going to say anything else. Thank you so much. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thank you for your
Samir.
comments.
So, I think we're going to start to wrap up here. Something's been, actually, I think two things have been missed that are big ones about how I think all of us here are helping preserve wilderness character. Even if you're not doing trail clearing, campsite inventories, invasive species. Yes, Abigail, you got it. This is where I'm going. Education. If you're doing education about wilderness, whether in wilderness or outside of wilderness, at a kiosk, in a school, with your friends and family about the qualities of wilderness, I believe that helps preserve wilderness quality, helps people understand the value that we're trying to provide to preserve our wilderness, helping people understand these concepts, education, both in their actions, but also about these things. Marissa, did you have a thought about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great addition. And I think a lot of us, even if we don't come from a wilderness background, but coming from any type of conservation background, have a lot of relevant skills in that, or have had other opportunities where they've talked to members of the public about conservation, leave no trace, bear safety, all of these topics that relate very closely to wilderness qualities and preserving wilderness. So I think it's a really easy shift to incorporate talking about these qualities into your other conversations about leave no trace or anything else that you're talking to members of the public or students, whoever it is that you reach out to.
Yeah. And then the other one I wanted to throw out there was people who manage data. You might not be the one doing the work in the field, but if you're managing data or doing analysis, and I know Portia was on the line. I don't know if you still are, Portia, but that's a shout out to Portia. I know Christy's done this, Julia's done this, Marissa's done this. You might not be the person who does the field element in this audience. If you're feeling that way, I don't do this stuff. But if you're the person, the lab tech who processes the water quality data, you're helping preserve wilderness character. So this is meant to be sort of an empowering and creative notion here that there is all kinds of ways, even if it's education or data management, you might be helping preserve wilderness character. I see this question here about promoting and advertising wilderness. I'm wondering if there's some other sessions that have covered this we could refer people to, but Marissa, do you have a thought on
Yes,
this?
I have a thought on this. I'd love to address this because this is a great question. So yeah, Brenda, how do you promote advertised wilderness without sending people to your wilderness, which might be getting loved to death, right? So here's something I want to remind folks is wilderness character is these five qualities that are the tangible aspects of wilderness character. These are the things that we can actually monitor. We can go out, collect data on. We can put a number or a value to. There are intangible aspects of wilderness and wilderness character. These are the personal values, the spiritual values, the connectedness that one feels when going into wilderness. They're the thoughts and personal values that people have on these places, and we can't measure them, but they're just as important, right? So people valuing the wilderness and never visiting it is still still so great for wilderness character and preserving wilderness. And in fact, we do have wilderness areas that are close to the public, and they may be because they're protecting a really scarce resource or a resource that is really easily impacted by the presence of humans. But those places are preserving wilderness character, right? We may not have that primitive unconfined recreation opportunity, but the natural quality is being preserved. And we just can't have both, unfortunately, in some places. So still valuing these places, thinking they're worthwhile to save for future generations is something to incorporate into your discussions with these folks.
Cool. That was inspiring. Thank you, Marissa. Okay, well, we need to wrap up here. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for helping brainstorm with Marissa and I. I hope that as you continue on in your wilderness stewardship work, you keep this thought and this question with you. How am I helping preserve wilderness character? And continue to touch base with those qualities of wilderness and wilderness character. How are you doing that? And just bringing it back to that, and then continue with education, because that is the way to bring it all together. Thank you, everybody.